Okay, so in section 3.1 we talked about basic functions. This book refers to them as the Toolkit Functions, and there were 9 of them. One of our textbooks refers to them as the library of functions. Anyway, the basic functions are the Toolkit Functions, and what they want us to do, we're going to do a quick review, and then we're going to talk about the domain and range for each one of them, and some of them are a little bit different. I went ahead and just made like rough X and Y axes so I could graph these. These are just going to be rough sketches. Okay, so a constant function, that's just a horizontal line. So what would the domain be? All real numbers. But the range, this one's kind of different. The range is just going to be one output. There's only one output. That's the C. I didn't put the equation. It's f of x equals c. So whatever that number is that your function equals, the constant, that's your only output. Okay, the identity function, which is f of x equals x, and it looks like this. Your domain, all real numbers, and your range, all real numbers. The absolute value function, so we write that as f of x equals the absolute value of x. We're going to talk more about that one in a little bit. But it looked like a V shape, probably not like that, but something like that. And the domain, well, that's going to be all real numbers, negative infinity to infinity. But the range, that only goes from 0 up to infinity. So you can think about that. Your lowest point, though, is 0 for that basic absolute value function. I put absolute function. It should say absolute value function. That was my bad. Okay, I'll try to fix that. All right, the quadratic function. The quadratic function says f of x equals x squared. And it makes a parabola shape. Oops. Kind of like that. The domain is all real numbers. The range is just like the absolute value one, 0 to infinity, and it's going to include the 0. The cubic function, okay, so f of x equals x cubed, and that looks something like that snake kind of shape. The domain is all real numbers, and the range is all real numbers. So I'm kind of going through these quick. You might have to go back and think about these in a little bit and look at them. The reciprocal function, that says f of x equals 1 over x. Now this one's different because it has asymptotes. So we don't include the x-axis or the y-axis for this function. It's not defined there. So, and it looks something like, this is a horrible drawing, but something like that. The domain then, well, it's not all real numbers because you can't include 0. So it's going to be from negative infinity to 0, but don't include the 0, and from 0 to infinity. And the range actually is going to do the same thing because we can't include the x-axis. So. Okay, so that's domain and range for the reciprocal function. That was a little bit different. The reciprocal squared function. So f of x equals 1 over x squared. And if you remember, there's asymptotes here, and it's really steep, but it looks something like that. On both sides, it should look the same. But anyway. The domain then, oops, is going to be from negative infinity to 0, union 0 to infinity, because we can't have x be 0. It's not defined here, right? Well, now I've made a mess on my graph, but the range, that one's going to be a little bit different, right? Because it doesn't have any negative values, so it's only going, not including 0 though, 0 to infinity. So it would look like that. Alrighty. Let's see, on we go. The square root function, f of x equals the square root of x. And if you remember, it starts at 0, 0, and it kind of goes off like that. So what's the domain going to be? Well, it's going to include 0, but it's only going in the positive direction to infinity. The range is going to be the same. 0 to infinity. And you might say, well, it's not going up very much as it gets larger. No, it's not, but it's still going up a little bit. Okay, the cube root function, f of x equals the cubed root of x. That was like the sideways snake, kind of like that. Okay, not really like that. Okay, that's going to be a domain of all real numbers and a range of all real numbers. And I think that's it for the 9 functions, 9 basic functions.